The indigenous history of Northeast Florida stretches back more than 13,000 years. But today, Jacksons are most familiar with the Timucua, who had occupied the land for centuries by the time Jean Ribault arrived in 1562. Given how long they were here, it's not surprising that Jacksonville is littered with references to what was once the region's largest indigenous population. You can find the Timucua name on schools and streets, camps and country clubs, even a veterinarian's office.
Head north a bit, and there's even a brewery in Nassau County named after the Mocama, the Timucua speakers who lived in the Jacksonville area.
But where are the Timucua themselves?
The commonly accepted narrative says they disappeared centuries ago. According to a handful of documents, a census list from a Spanish archive, a parish registry, and the minutes of the town council of Guanabacoa, Cuba, the last of the Timucua was a man named Juan Alonso Cabale, who died in 1767.
But as is often the case, the truth is far more complicated and uncertain than the stories we frequently repeat about Jacksonville's past.
Juan Alonso Cabale's my name, Florida's native son, sent to die in some Cuban land. I'm the last Timucuan.
I'm Brendan Rivers.
I'm Tammy Cherry.
And this is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. In this episode, we conclude our exploration of myths and misconceptions about local indigenous history, focusing on the Timucua, a group of peoples who lived in what's now South Georgia and North Florida and spoke the Timucua language, as well as the Mocama, Timucua speakers who lived in the area around modern-day Jacksonville. Keep in mind, neither group would have referred to themselves by those names, which were first applied by Europeans and later adopted by scholars. We start where the story of indigenous Northeast Florida so often ends, with the last of the Timucua.
A quick warning before we get started. For historical context, we'll be sharing quotes from primary sources that may contain racist or derogatory language.
By the time Juan Alonso Cabale died in 1767, the Timucua had been entangled with Europeans for over 200 years, probably the most sustained contact that any indigenous group had with Europeans in the Southeast. When European colonists first arrived, indigenous people who spoke dialects of the Timucua language controlled most of the northern third of modern-day Florida and much of south-central and southeastern Georgia. According to Denise Boussy, a history professor at the University of North Florida who teaches courses on local indigenous history, the arrival of Europeans had a profound and lasting impact on the Timucua-speaking world, including the local Mocama.
By the 1650s, the region is coming under a lot of new stress, especially emanating out of Virginia, where English colonizers have launched commercial slave raids and sponsored different indigenous groups to lead those raids. And that begins to push into our region and actually push people into our region. So we have two other additional groups of indigenous people who begin to move in, largely in response to these slave raids that are now raining down on interior and coastal Georgia and much of Florida too, what we call those places today. And so we begin to see in the 1660s, two different groups of indigenous people move in, the Yamasees, who I'm writing the first big book about, and also the Guales, who are from coastal Georgia and begin to move more into the Mocama territory.
Roughly 50,000 indigenous people were enslaved across the South between the 1650s and 1710s, many of them from Florida, where English slavers specifically targeted indigenous people allied with the Spanish and those living in mission towns. These raids, combined with disease, decimated the mission's populations. By 1752, the mission-dwelling indigenous Floridians are condensed in 5 small refugee villages near St. Augustine. 7 years later, as the number of mission residents continues to dwindle, the Spanish decide to combine those 5 small towns into 2. One of those was Nombre de Dios, where Cabale lived.
We do know that Juan Alonso Cabale was born in St. Augustine at Nombre de Dios, the mission site that's now there at the Nuestra Señora de la Leche shrine. That's where he was born. That's where he lived. He was a Timucua speaker. He probably also spoke Spanish. I'll bet he also spoke Yamasee. He would have been Catholic, and he would have been baptized as a kid. But by the time he was born in 1709, the missions were already being beaten up, and so his parents could well have been refugees moved from either north of St. Augustine, like on Amelia Island, or from some of the missions in the interior, in the Gainesville general area.
That's Gerald Milanish, Curator Emeritus at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida.
On February 10, 1763, the great powers of Europe signed the First Treaty of Paris and officially end the 7 Years' War, a massive global conflict that'll shape colonial control of North America. Spain, which had lost both Cuba and the Philippines to Great Britain the previous year, is forced to trade Florida to get those valuable colonies back.
And with a stroke of the pen, Florida suddenly becomes a British colony.
The result is a mass exodus of Spanish citizens. Between April 1763 and January 1764, around 3,000 people are evacuated from the former Spanish colony. Most of the residents from the capital of St. Augustine, including those living in the Catholic missions, are sent to Cuba. Among the evacuees are 15 families of indigenous Floridians. Cabale, along with his Yamasee wife and their 2 children, were among the 90 or so remaining mission-dwelling Native Americans transported to Cuba during the Spanish Exodus. But the immigrants, who were settled at Guanabacoa, an indigenous community about 6 miles from Havana, don't do well there.
Within 5 years, 11 of the 15 heads of household die, including Manuel Riso, the only other Timucua speaker in the group, who at over 90 years old may not have even survived the journey. Cabale himself would die on November 14, 1767, the last of the Timucua.
Or was he? Because evidence suggests the story of the Timucua was far from over.
More on that after the break.
Join the most essential conversation in Northeast Florida and Southeast Georgia. Every day on First Coast Connect, hear from the biggest newsmakers and changemakers in the region. We also want your phone calls, emails, and tweets. Engagement is what drives this program. I'm Ann Schindler. Join us weekdays at 9 a.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Hi, join me, Dr. Joe Servin, for What's Health Got to Do with It, a weekly program that examines where and how healthcare intersects with your daily life. I'll speak with local and national healthcare leaders to help you navigate your most pressing medical issues. Email health@wjct.org to join the conversation and tune in Saturdays at 4 p.m. and Sundays at 9 p.m. on WJCT News 89.9.
Here's the funny thing about facts taken out of context. They can be both true and misleading.
That might just be the case with the Spanish records upon which the story of the last Timucua rests, according to David Scheidecker, Senior Research Coordinator for the Seminole Tribe of Florida.
So there's one Spanish document that's dated, and we took all the Indians with us when we left, and somehow that got grabbed onto. I mentioned the narrative that there were no indigenous people left in Florida. That's been grabbed onto as evidence, but it was the Spanish just referring to we took all of the mission indigenous people with us. It didn't refer to the entire state and somehow got taken for that. No, there were Timucua who were still here.
For one thing, a map of Florida from 1768, a year after Cabale's death in Cuba, shows a village of Timucua still living in the Okefenokee Swamp. While 18th century maps tend to reflect their creators' beliefs more than actual geography, this one, made by Juan Josef Elixio de la Puente, one of the 3 men who orchestrated and executed the evacuation of St. Augustine's indigenous population, suggests that the Spanish never assumed that the indigenous people in their missions were the only ones remaining in the state. In fact, they had good reason to know that there were others, including many who had relocated away from Spanish settlements. Here's Denise Bussy again.
So the Spanish, it's become a joke in my teaching. The Spanish often in almost every document talk about indigenous people who are going into the woods. And it's that phrase constantly, into the woods. They're going into the woods. I see a musical, in the future. And the woods are really not woods. They're places anywhere that the Spanish don't know. So what we see is that the Spanish are reaching the limit of what they know, and they know more is going on, but they don't know what it is. So those woods could be just on the edge of the coast. So there could very well be many Mocamas and Guales and Yamasees who remain in the region, but the Spanish just don't know because they're all in the woods.
Even if the Spanish had believed the fewer than 100 Native Americans they evacuated to Cuba were the last in the state, there's no reason to take that at face value.
The Spanish population in Florida was relatively small. At its peak, only a few thousand.
And they were mostly concentrated in St. Augustine and Pensacola, with a handful of soldiers and friars scattered across a loosely connected string of missions.
So usually their news comes not as it does on NPR, full and rich, but it comes in little tiny snippets of information that indigenous informants are willing to give. And the Spanish try to put that together and then claim that they understand the whole picture when really their understanding is very, very limited.
So whether the Spanish knew it or not, the Timucua remained in Florida and began to merge with other indigenous populations, a process that accelerated when hostilities with the United States flared up in the early 1800s.
Because of war, because of everyone getting forced together, especially once the Seminole War begins and you have a common enemy, everyone's getting pushed together. At that time, the majority of people were Muskogean, and there definitely was cultural loss. Just flat out, there was cultural loss from all these different groups coming together. It's the ethnogenesis of the Seminole people.
In other words, the Timucua and other indigenous groups are forced together. Cultures and languages start to mix, a process that isn't always peaceful, and eventually they coalesce, becoming the federally recognized tribes we know today.
Both the Muskogee or Creek Nation of Oklahoma and the Seminole Tribe of Florida have claimed the Timucua as ancestors. The Timucua probably have surviving descendants outside of those tribes as well. But the narrative suggesting that Timucua history ends with the death of Juan Alonso Cabale persists.
Having a clear endpoint for the Timucua has its uses for some. The story of Cabale as the last Timucua can be seen as Northeast Florida's own version of the terminal narrative, the falsehood that indigenous people have gone extinct.
There's a name for it. It's called terra nullius, the theory of no man's land, that when you got there, no one or no one of significance was occupying, so it's okay that you take everything. It gives a justification, it dodges moral problems for the colonizing power.
Treating the area along the St. Johns River as if it were a land belonging to no one erases the territoriality of the local Mocamas, Guales, and Yamasees, who signed no treaties and never ceded their land. And treating Juan Alonso Cabale as the last Timucua helps erase the unbroken indigenous presence in Florida.
And the biggest thing now that we're trying to undo the myth of is that the Seminole aren't from Florida. Generally, the idea is that it's said that they came down from Georgia or Alabama. They only moved down after all of the Native Americans of Florida were wiped out or taken away by the Spanish. And therefore, because there were actually Europeans here before the Seminole came down, that they have no right to the land. That's a very useful narrative for government, basic settlers, colonials. It's also false. And the Seminole come from the people of Florida. There are also people who came down at that time period who joined with the group that became the Seminole before they were the Seminole. But there's no point that Florida was empty of Native Americans.
According to Bussy, the issues stem from earlier scholarship, which relied too heavily on Spanish documents, and from the need to craft some kind of clear historical narrative.
Because it's really hard to start a story, and you need to start and end it somewhere. And so it used to be that we started and ended our narratives, our historical narratives, with European colonization and ended it with whatever we could find in European archives. And now, only really in the last 20 years have scholars really begun to question that chronology. So whose chronology should we use to tell a story of North America? Do we start when Europeans arrive and end when they leave? Do we begin much earlier? And that requires us to go beyond archival documents. And most historians are not trained beyond archival documents.
In Northeast Florida, that story often focuses tightly on the Timucua, starting in 1562 with the arrival of Ribault and stopping dead in 1767 with Cabale. This narrative leaves out the region's other indigenous populations, like the Yamasee and Guale, and ignores continued indigenous presence in the area.
And yet, present they are through at least the late 19th century, turning up persistently at the margins of a historical record that has largely written them out.
In December of 1775, the Lower Creeks, who would later be known as the Seminoles, meet with British Governor Patrick Tonin for 2 weeks in what's now Jacksonville before signing the Treaty of Calford and agreeing to side with Loyalists against the upstart American rebels to the north. They keep their promise, repeatedly skirmishing in the area with any rebels who try to push south from Georgia. In a letter from late January of 1777, Tonin recounts how his indigenous allies foiled an effort by American troops disguised in British uniforms.
The Indians by themselves forced back the rebels when they had advanced as far as the Calford, and had they not discovered men dressed in red at their fires in the nighttime, they would have surprised them.
Despite the best efforts of the British, Florida eventually joins the newly formed United States, becoming a territory in 1821. By that time, the first of what would become known as the Seminole Wars had already started. They would end more than 30 years later with the U.S. abandoning its attempt to remove the last of the state's indigenous population.
Most of the conflict is confined to South Florida, but is still felt in the Jacksonville area, especially in 1836, when Seminoles attack and kill a trader named George Mott at his home on Julington Creek, and then the Jones family several months later.
John Clark, whose father ran a mill that Jacksonville farmers used to grind their corn, was 3 when the Seminole Wars ended in 1858. He described his childhood encounters with the local indigenous population to Rose Shepard, who documented it for the Federal Writers Project in 1938.
In course of the season, there was quite an accumulation of meal, and young Clark, loading a rowboat half full, would go out to Horse Landing, near Mandarin Point, and trade it to the Indians, who were quite numerous in that section, taking in return hides. These were in turn shipped to New York, where they were sold for a good price.
Just one of the fleeting glimpses into the ongoing existence of an indigenous presence in the area.
Much of our understanding of the past is gleaned from written documents. In the case of our region's indigenous history, for centuries we've relied on American and European documents, whether they be maps, copper engravings, or parish registries, which were more tangible and easier to collect than the oral histories of the remaining indigenous communities.
In recent years, scholars have worked to fill the gaps, incorporating indigenous perspectives in a way that leads to a more vibrant and complicated view of the past.
But as archaeologist Keith Ashley, who teaches anthropology at the University of North Florida, notes, it can be hard to tell stories that keep evolving.
Sometimes we can do things that are really complicated, that are uncertain and couched in certain ways, so sometimes people will try to simplify it.
Like turning the death of one man into the death of an entire people.
And when they simplify it, it takes away the accuracy of it. Then they will try to stamp on it that this is the way that it is, and then people will read it. Oh, it's written in stone. This is the way it is. Why are you trying to change it? We're changing it because there's more and better evidence that's come forward.
If we approach history with an open mind, we'll see that it's often messy and that there's still so much we don't know. And the things we think we know, the simple stories we tell ourselves, well, they don't always turn out to be true. This is Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media. Thanks for listening. I'm Brendan Rivers.
And I'm Tammy Cherry.
A big thanks to Jennifer Gray and her colleagues at Florida State College at Jacksonville, whose research made this podcast possible.
If you're interested in learning more about the River City's past, check out FSCJ's History of Jacksonville course.
If you'd like to learn more about local indigenous history, take a look at the show notes at wjct.org/bygonejacks, where you can find links to the sources we used and more.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review.